Hello and welcome to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, February 9th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined by two very distinguished journalists today. We're very pleased to welcome to our virtual studio Stewart Ledbetter, who is the reporter and 5:30 anchor for NBC5 up in Burlington, WPTZ. He is also, of course, the moderator for Vermont This Week on Vermont Public, which is absolutely must-see TV for all Vermonters who want to stay abreast of state news and politics. Stewart grew up in Dorset and Manchester. He attended local elementary school and then went away to high school in Massachusetts before returning to Vermont to attend UVM. And while a senior, he wandered into the campus radio station, which eventually led to jobs in Vermont commercial radio and television newsrooms. He spent 35 years as a political reporter, an anchor, and news director at WPTZ, and since 2007 has also been the moderator for the long-running Friday night political roundtable Vermont This Week on Vermont Public Television Channel. Stewart has also won the National Edward R. Murrow Award for reporting and has been inducted into the Vermont Association of Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Stewart, thank you very much for making the time for being with us tonight. It's a great honor to have you with us.
Happy to do it, Andrew. Thanks for the invitation.
And Kyle Midura is a politics producer with the PBS Newshour. Kyle grew up right here in Sunderland and graduated from Burton Academy in 2005 before attending Northwestern University. He began his career with the NBC affiliate in Billings, Montana before coming home to Vermont, spending 6 years at WCAX where he covered the State House and Vermont politics. In September of 2017, he moved down to Washington DC where he served WCAX in more than 100 gray television stations as a national political correspondent. Kyle joined the PBS Newshour just less than a year ago as a producer of the program's politics team, and where he primarily covers Congress and the Supreme Court. And last but hardly least, I need to mention that he's also a member of the Burton Academy's Athletic Hall of Fame, and was an important member of the Bulldogs Division II state championship team that year. Kyle, great to have you back on the Press Pass.
Thanks for reminding me that I peaked in high school, Andrew.
So, two hometown boys who made good. Great to have you both with us here tonight. And Kyle, let me start with you. We had a very busy news week this week, and not over yet. And of course, the big story of this week was President Biden's State of the Union address earlier. I guess I just wondered, what were your takeaways from that? That was, watching it on television, I thought, wow, well, this is a little more boisterous than we've been used to. What did you make of it all?
Yeah, what was once atypical and a one-off back in 2008 is now almost commonplace, so much so that the president seemed to not only plan for it, but to, in a way, goad it so he could use it as a foil. But even outside the chamber, what really struck me is just how much we're seeing a quote-unquote return to normal. I mean, outside the Capitol, there was fencing up, which is to be expected in a post-January 6th world on big events like this. But you weren't really seeing masks. You weren't really seeing social distancing. It felt like a normal State of the Union atmosphere inside the building and outside the building for the first time since the pandemic, since 2020, when the State of the Union was given just before the pandemic hit. So that was one of the elements that really struck me. The president delivered his address. He's denied that this is a precursor, a foreshadowing of what's to come when he's expected to run for re-election. But I think you heard him trying out some of the ideas and themes that we might see from him on the campaign trail if and when he does go that route, which is expected. He leaned into some populist ideas, talking about junk fees, talking about dealing with prescription drug pricing. It's unclear even if those ideas that were roundly applauded can get through a Congress that's this divided. We haven't really seen yet just how much this narrow GOP majority in the House is going to play ball with Biden and the Democratic Senate majority, which is also narrow, though a little bit wider than last term in the Senate. So that was interesting to me that he leaned into that. He talked about the bipartisan successes of the previous Congress, when, to the president's credit, he did get more done than many of us in the press thought might be possible. And then there was the rowdiness you mentioned, which none of us were truly prepared for, to see it quite like that, but also didn't strike us as too much of a surprise either. It's just a new reality, it seems.
Yeah, indeed. Well, Stuart, what was your takeaway on it?
Watching from my living room, so it's a totally different perspective than when you're right there, as Kyle was. But the bad behavior, the name calling, the lack of decorum. I've seen a lot of State of the Unions, and this wasn't our finest moment, expected or not. It was too long, I thought. I think they're almost always too long. But for an 80-year-old president who talked fast, and it was still an hour and 15, 20 minutes, he seemed pretty energized to me. And as Kyle said, he rattled off a few accomplishments. I mean, the country thinks that the economy is doing terribly, and some of the data would suggest otherwise, but his poll numbers are in the tank. So, it was perhaps effective from that point of view.
Well, one thought I had when I was watching and he was conveying so much energy was that this was probably the opening salvo in the 2024 presidential election, is it not? Clearly, there's some question about whether or not President Biden should run for re-election. Is he just going to be too old? Would he be unelectable because of that? He seemed to be clearly trying to kind of say, hey, I've still got a couple of fastballs left in the bag.
It bears noting, I mean, he said this wasn't a preview, and yet just in the next coming days, he was in Wisconsin and then in Florida. And Florida might no longer be a swing state based on what we've seen recently, but it's home to Governor Ron DeSantis, who does appear to be a probable challenger. So, he can say this wasn't a preview, but then he made those trips. So it certainly does have those appearances.
He's running second to Pete Buttigieg for the Democratic 2024 presidential nomination in New Hampshire. I happened to look this week. And so, which is kind of embarrassing, isn't it, for the president to have one of his cabinet members outperforming him in the first or one of the first traditional nominating contests?
Yeah, well, can we say there maybe one of the first? I think we're still safe in saying it'll be really, really interesting to see how that all plays out now that the DNC has voted. Of course, New Hampshire will have to decide to play ball, and if we expect that this is more coronation than really a true challenge, as I would be surprised if the transportation secretary, or Secretary Pete, as I've taken to call him, truly does mount a challenge there. I'll be interested. You
wouldn't challenge the boss if you want to keep your job, I wouldn't think.
I would imagine it would not be the best political maneuver for the secretary, but it does. The fact that this is not likely to be a competitive race on the Democratic side does make that whole New Hampshire situation more interesting to watch from the outside, because you might not be as concerned about losing delegates at the convention if they're going to be meaningless anyway.
Yeah, that's going to be fun to follow, seeing how that goes. Well, anyway, let's pivot for a moment here back home to Montpelier, where Stuart, I know you've been following things in the legislature and the State House. I guess bring us up to speed. What are you seeing? What bills are you seeing kind of moving forward more rapidly, perhaps, than others? I mean, it's still a long way to go, very early in the session, but any indications that certain bills are going to be emphasized by the Democratic leadership?
Well, there are so many more Democrats than there have ever been. So there isn't, in some respects, as much drama over a policy disagreement with the Republican governor now, because Democrats have more than enough support to sort of do what they want if they stick together. And but that said, there are some really big policy conversations that are underway at the State House. I was telling Kyle before we started, there's a ton of new members in the House and in the Senate. So they're still feeling their way through, but there is a very expensive couple of bills to expand child care to try to make it something akin to a universal system. Hugely expensive, according to a new consultant's report. A lot of interest in finally adopting a universal paid family and medical leave act, again, over the governor's objection. That's expensive, not as expensive as childcare. There's a gun reform bill that has 9 separate components that would impact juvenile justice. And maybe the overarching priority for really Republicans and Democrats is housing, building a lot more new housing, and not just with money, but also by reforming, that age-old debate around Act 250 and local zoning restrictions, maybe avoiding the duplicative permitting required both by communities and by Act 250 to really accelerate construction. We are, by some measures, 35 or 40,000 units below what we need to see to establish some kind of market equilibrium where your rents would be affordable for a working class person, where you'd have more inventory for home ownership. So, those are 4 really big. I mean, one of those would be a big story in any year, and there are at least 4 big issues this year at the Capitol.
That housing bill is one that we're following very closely down here in southern Vermont, because one of our legislators, Seth Bongartz, is one of the principal folks who's involved in drafting that legislation. And I've been fascinated to see whether or not that aspect around downtown zoning is going to pass muster in a lot of places. I mean, my initial reaction was, my gosh, here in Vermont, we like to think in terms of local control, right? And I'm just trying to picture all these select boards and planning boards saying, well, thank you very much, Montpelier, but guess what? We're going to do it our way. And if we feel like it, we'll go along. But if not, hey, have a nice day.
Well, that's right. There's a lot of NIMBY, despite the fact that we deny it. And towns that want to preserve their character. The problem is that when every town does that, there is, and it has been building up. We don't build as much new housing as the market would like. There's also a companion effort to try to renovate, crummy old houses that have fallen into disrepair as a means of quickly bringing more units to market. Second floor unused spaces. Woodstock, for example, was making an effort there. So there's a lot of money to spend, but the Bongartz bill, which I think one of the components would require that a town allow at least 5 units, at least, per acre, if that property is serviced by town water and sewer, to try to encourage development, which is what we say we want, in downtown areas, and not build out in the countryside, on cow fields. That's always been what Montpelier has said it wants, and yet, this Seth Bongartz bill is interesting. When Kyle and I were reporting at the State House a few years ago, I couldn't imagine a bill like this getting very far, and yet here we are in 2023.
I was looking for a house right before I left Vermont, and I remember thinking that was out of my price range. And as I've been looking for housing down here in DC, thinking, oh man, this is crazy expensive. Maybe that dream up in Vermont could still be true. Pop on Zillow, what have you, see what the prices like are looking up there. And they're comparable, which just blows my mind every time I look. I thought they were out of control when I was up there. And to see the housing costs that Vermonters are dealing with, especially in the Chittenden County region, but even in southwestern Vermont where I grew up, the influx of people, I have a hard time imagining how most Vermonters are making that work right now on the financing end. Yeah,
they spend a tremendous percentage of their income on housing, or they have to drive a long way. I mean, it was true, Andrew. I mean, where do the waitresses and waiters and the retail clerks in the outlet shops in Manchester live?
New York, in Granville, and across the state line, and they drive a long way to get here, and it's it just seems very unsustainable in the long run. But right now, trying to find an apartment or a house in Manchester or any of the area around here is like next to impossible. There is no inventory. It was interesting to me to see if post-pandemic that was going to ease up a bit, because we had such an influx of folks move here in 2020, 2021. But it almost is irrelevant now because there is no inventory.
Right. And yet we say we need more people to move to Vermont, or else our economy will stall. So many schools are, have a lot of half-empty classrooms. And, our state is aging. So who is going to take the next generation of jobs? Well, the obvious fact here is that you have no chance of attracting somebody from another state to come and take a job here if there is no place for them to live.
Right. Kyle, I was wondering, are you hearing anything in Congress about a sort of a federal approach to try and, amp up the number of houses that are available across the country? Because I think it really is a national problem. But is there any sense that, this is a problem that will be approached on a national
We've heard
basis?
the administration make some noise, HUD make some noise. You get a handful of bills here and there that purport to try to make things a little bit cheaper, housing a little bit more accessible, price caps, those sorts of things. But we're not seeing anything moving. Now, granted, it is really early in this Congress. But based on what we have seen so far, I imagine you're going to see two sorts of legislation passing through this Congress. One will be the things that they absolutely cannot avoid. So eventually we will likely see the debt ceiling lifted. They'll get very close. They might push right up to the edge, but they're going to be forced to deal with that in some way, shape, or form. And that might mean that the president needs to find a way to back off from his I'm not going to negotiate here, and find a way where both sides can claim victory while they work out a deal. So there are the must-pass elements that they will eventually, as they typically do, find a way to accomplish. And then there are the easy wins. So we saw a resolution pass through Congress the other day condemning Chinese actions with the balloon as trampling on U.S. sovereignty. So outside of those two types of moves in Congress, I don't expect a lot of action, and I think housing would fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Oh, well, performance politics wins. I wanted to ask you, have you had a chance to meet up with now Congresswoman Becca Belt yet, and kind of get her thoughts on what it's like being in Congress as opposed to a state senator up in Montpelier?
I distinctly remember, I believe her first term at the Vermont State House was 2014. And I remember the first time I talked to her was the first couple of days in the new term. And I said, Ballant, Blent, what are we doing here? And she said, it's Ballant like talent. And so when she won the primary, our shop did a piece on how she was the last first woman, so to speak, in that Vermont was the last state to send a female to Congress, whether that be a senator or a representative. And so Lisa Desjardins, who ended up doing the piece, was asking me, how do you pronounce her last name? And I repeated it back verbatim. It's Ballant like talent. So she's good at figuring out how to make that stick. I have not seen her quite yet. Do expect to come to bump into her in the halls one of these days soon. I did see now Senator Welch just Tuesday on the State of the Union. He actually walked in right next to John Fetterman. And if there's anyone who can make you appear not tall, it is Senator Fetterman.
Yeah, 6'8" or something like that.
But she's on some interesting committees, so she'll be in the thick of it moving forward. She's on budget.
Yeah, great committee assignments.
Yeah, budget, which will be looking at laying out the spending priorities. It'll ultimately be up to the appropriators in order to figure out what gets spent, but they'll kind of lay out the priorities. And then she also landed on House Oversight, which is going to be one of the big investigative committees for the House Republicans. So you will see them talking about big tech and Hunter Biden and anything else that the GOP has pledged to look into. You can expect them to be taking up, and I think you'll see her in the middle of it.
All right. Well, that's interesting. Well, speaking of national politicians. Stuart, you had an interview recently with Vermont's now senior senator, Bernie Sanders, that was fascinating to watch. It's available on WPTZ's website for folks who might want to check it out. But you and the senator had a chance to kind of go through a few of the issues. He seems like he wants to kind of put the pedal to the metal on some of those things.
Yeah, he's the new chairman of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So he'll have a lot to say about the debate over raising the federal minimum wage, something that he's been talking about since well before his first run for president. $15 no longer the target now, not high enough, he said. He will make a big push to try to get a better understanding of what can be done to open competition and reduce the price of prescription drugs. I know there's been a lot of hay made of the first effort that has passed Congress for the first, 10 drugs that Medicare, the federal government could now negotiate price, but he thinks that's just the very, very minimum, and there's much more that can be done. It's the refrain that, frankly, when he was running for Congress, he led famously a busload of Vermonters up to a pharmacy in Quebec to make the point that why do Vermont seniors pay, 5, sometimes 10 times more for the same bottle of pills that a Canadian senior would, that in some cases comes from the exact same factory? That's the kind of thing that has always driven him nuts, and he is promising to get very aggressive on prescriptions. He was just today at a press conference in Washington over trying to extend paid sick leave to rail employees. That was missing from their latest contract. So he's, a lot of the issues that he's really built his whole campaign or his whole political career around are now front and center at the what they call the HELP committee. We asked him about a few other things. He didn't want to talk about 2024, for the record. He says it's way too early and nobody cares. Well, I think a lot of people in Vermont do care as to whether or not he's going to retire from the Senate, or whether he's going to run for re-election, or whether he's going to run third time for president. By the way, he's running fourth, Kyle, in New Hampshire among Democrats.
That's some slippage for him.
Oh, I saw it's the New Hampshire primary was, I guess, a year away,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, just about, yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, that's a state he won twice, right?
yeah. So he gave us about 10 minutes, Andrew, and that was a lot. He doesn't visit with Vermont reporters as he did for many, many years. He's pretty much focused on Washington.
He's hard to keep up with it for 80. He's very hard to keep up with as he's walking through the Capitol. I will tell you that.
The guy is unbelievable. He can make it across the room faster than any of us.
I'm glad you mentioned the HELP committee. That's going to be an interesting committee to watch. On the Republican side, Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana is an interesting person for Senator Sanders to be working with. He's very much someone who's going to be interested in diving into the details. He's a doctor by trade. There is room for him and Senator Sanders to work together on some of these issues. I mean, President Biden brought up the prescription drug measures. I could see movement there on the Senate. The question again is going to be, what does the House do with that? But those two have an interesting potential to work together, and it's one of the things I'm looking forward to getting a feel for in the coming weeks and months is just how those two operate together.
Interesting. Before we have to run, Kyle, I just did want to ask you, I understand your beat also includes the Supreme Court. Any cases that we might want to be aware of before an announcement comes out?
I don't have any inside scoop or leaked decisions to give you, Andrew, unfortunately. I wish I did.
Darn.
We've already seen a couple of interesting cases argued already this term, which began Back in October now, we saw a case that is very similar to the Masterpiece Cake Shop arguments from a few years ago, which basically says, what rights does a business have to not serve a same-sex couple if it doesn't fit within their worldview of morality. It's a little bit different in that this is a website designer, and they're not taking it from a religious liberty perspective per se, but more of from an artistic First Amendment freedom perspective. So that has been argued. We'll be waiting on a decision there. I mean, frankly, we're still, in many respects, waiting on a lot of these cases to be argued, but also starting to understand the impacts of last year's monumental decisions, whether that is the overturning of Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision, or one that's featuring in a lot of the state house gun debates, I'm sure much like the one Vermont is having, which was the New York State gun case, the Bruin case, which said that their restrictions went too far or simply were a little too arbitrary in figuring out who was given a permit and who wasn't. So plenty to be watching for with that court, that's for sure.
Absolutely. And Stuart, I also just wanted to ask you real quick, yesterday we had a rather dramatic event at the State House. The governor called a press conference at noon about a series of what turned out to be hoax phone calls about shooting events at I believe about 20 or 21 Vermont schools. Turned out to be, fortunately, thank God, just a hoax. But at that time, they didn't really have a whole lot of information. I just wondered, in the 24 hours or so since then, any new news that you've heard?
Yeah, there isn't. The state leaders promised that they and their federal partners are aggressively moving on this to try to identify who or what might be behind this. We don't know. We suspect that these calls did not originate from within Vermont. It was a voice that was sort of broken up, almost computer generated, but not apparently. There was a real person there, but maybe it was some kind of a distorting sound or mechanism used. But yeah, 21 schools from Bennington to the Canadian border were hit one after another, created a lot of concern and confusion. State leaders call it an act of terrorism intended to get a massive police response. So it was the largest that we've ever had, but New Hampshire and Maine have suffered similar incidents in the last several months. It's kind of a sign of the times, Andrew, and it's really unfortunate.
Sort of thing you never expected to hear about in Vermont, I guess. Well, of course, we had that strange event up in the Champlain Islands there over the weekend with the basketball game riot. So I suppose
adults behaving badly. That's right.
Yeah. Over a middle school basketball game. I just don't get it. But anyway.
And it wasn't just in Grand Isle. I mean, there have been incidents in with racist or sexist language or slurs yelled often by spectators at these overheated school games. I mean, it's the governor's very concerned about this, but he said the Grand Isle incident, I think his phrase is just plain sad.
Yeah.
What kind of an example are adults making in front of their kids?
Well, we'll have to leave it there for today. I know that we could easily talk for another half an hour about all kinds of issues that are underway and going on, but I just want to thank you both again for making the time tonight for this conversation. Stuart Ledbetter, the reporter and anchor for WPTZ NBC5 in Burlington. Kyle Midura, the politics producer for Public Broadcasting System. Thank you both very much. And well, if you're ever back down here in the home turf in Manchester, let me know and we'll have to go out to lunch or something. But thanks again for making the time. And thanks again to all of you who were watching. Hope you found our program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time on Press Pass. Meanwhile, have a great day.